Well, we meet again.
So there's people, No Life, which is not a great name, right?
R5 Firmware 1.1 has been released. Spoiler alert, go update your cameras. It's an excellent update. It's going to massively improve your camera. Now, just quickly get it out of the way. The firmware doesn't turn your camera into a C200 or a C300 Mark III. It doesn't magically turn the camera into a cinema camera. It's still a hybrid camera at its heart, and I don't think that's ever going to change. What the firmware does do is improve the recovery times. It extends the recording times just a notch, but most importantly, it enables the environmental ambient sensor to play a much bigger factor into the camera than the other sensors. So I want to get into some of the testing that I've been doing, which was mainly all external recording testing. It's safe to say that if you update to this firmware, you won't have any issues with the external recording. So for people that were worried about this no card hack or the no battery hack and how Canon might come along and patch this with a firmware update, that is not the case. The first test I did was with no cards in the camera, with a dummy battery in, external to the Atomos Ninja, with the screen on auto off, and I got upwards of 3 hours, and I just concluded the test there. 3 hours, there was no overheat warning. It was going strong, so I figured it's the same, basically. I can bet money that you're going to get 4 hours, and it might be improved. You might actually be able to get 5 hours out of it instead of the 4 hours. You might be able to get 6 hours out of it. I just didn't test it that long. I'll let you know if any testing comes along that disproves that. But currently, 3 hours and 15 minutes is the time that I got. And then I was just like, this is fine. There's no overheat warning. We're good to go. So that's great news. Then I did another test with no cards in the slot, but with a battery inside, an old Canon battery, so the LP6 batteries, and no problems there either. So the camera was running strong until the battery died. So then I concluded that there, which was around 2 hours. I can, bet that if you popped in another battery, you could probably just keep going. But the same sort of setup, 4K HQ, 30 all eye. I had the display option set to auto off. And that seems to work just as well. Now is where we get to the really great news. So thanks to the YouTuber John Gress, he showed in his video that it may be the screen that is producing most of the heat in these cameras. And he showcased that during his test, he got up to 40 minutes with the screen on the camera the entire time, also external to the Atomos. So I wanted to do that test, and I wanted to see if those times were better, because a lot of people, the way that they use these cameras is they're constantly using the camera screen to do focusing and to go through other menu options and stuff. They're not solely using the external monitor. So I wanted to do a test to see how long the camera can go with the screen on the entire time. I got through an entire Canon LP-E6H, which is the new Canon battery, before I concluded the test. That time was 2.5 hours compared to the 40 minutes that John Gress got. And the settings were 4K HQ at 30 frames per second, all eye UHD. There were no cards in the slot. Again, it was a Canon LP6NH, and I had it so the display option was both the camera and external, and I had it so the display shut off every 30 minutes. So after it shut off for 30 minutes, because you can't do it, never shuts off, I just pressed it again. So the camera screen never turned off. It just continuously was on. So a couple of things there. You got 2.5 hours with the camera screen on the entire time on one battery, which is pretty good. Like, that's a pretty good thing. And also, the camera didn't overheat to shut down. Now, I did get an overheat warning at 1.5 hours. So we're at 2 hours exactly. We're still going. The overheat warning has been on for half an hour now, but it definitely is going strong. And look at the battery. We're almost at the end of the battery here. That would be great news if this ran until the battery died. That would be excellent, because remember, the screen has been on the entire time. But it continued to record for another hour, and it never shut off. It never actually overheated and shut down. It went until the battery was depleted. So that's a huge, huge improvement, and really just gives a lot more confidence to this camera for those who are using this camera with a Ninja and are always using the screen for focus and for, whatever other reasons you're going to use the screen for. So that's excellent. So I can imagine after you get your 2.5 hours of shooting, right, you pop your battery out, it's time to pop another one in there, maybe take a couple minute break to kind of let it cool down and relieve that overheating warning. You can probably go for another 2.5 hours. That's a very, very, very big improvement worth the firmware update alone. Then I did another test to see if the cards in the camera ended up affecting anything. Because if you remember, one of my theories was that those cards were a big source of heat. So maybe Canon's firmware might have fixed that. Well, in this case, I had it so it was external 4K HQ, 30 frames per second, all-eye UHD. I had a CFast Express card in there. I had the display option set to both the camera and external, but I had it set so the camera screen turned off when it wasn't in use. But I did turn the camera screen on intermittently. Around every 5 to 10 minutes, I would just touch the screen just to kind of emulate real world usage. And the recording buffer said 25 minutes from a cold start. After an hour, it then stated 20 minutes. So then I popped in an SD card and I ran for another hour, and that dropped down from 20 minutes to 15 minutes. Then I just continued to run that test with both of those cards in there until the battery ran out, which was around 2 hours. And this was the older LP6 battery, not the new Canon battery. So it seems as if the cards don't play that much of a role in factoring overheating that much. So this is a really good firmware update for anyone that's using these cameras as an external recorder. It seems keeping the display on does cause the temperature to rise faster, but compared to firmware 1.0, it's far, far better. I can safely say you can expect 2+ hours with an external recorder and the camera screen on the entire time in 4K HQ. Also, it needs to be stated that you can now use overheat control in that option where you have both of those display options. So when you set it to camera screen on as well as external, you can now use overheat control, and that was added in this firmware. And I think that played a major role in allowing these cameras to run a lot longer externally with the camera screen on. Now, it still does seem to be that the best case scenario for this camera for long form continuous recording is to pop the cards out, put a dummy battery in there, and limit your screen on time. That's going to give you the best time. So if you need 3, 4, 5 hours of recording, then you're going to want to use that solution just to have like the safest bet. But this firmware has basically made it so that the screen, that the cards, and the battery no longer play a significant role in overheating the camera. This is excellent news for anyone that needs long-form continuous recording at the best 4K option on this camera. But that's not it. So there was a user in the Canon Rumors Discord group that I've been in contact with, Jodu Media. He's been doing his own testing, and we found some pretty shocking results. So if you remember in Gordon Lang's video, the ambient sensor, he states, is near the port side of the camera. And now we know that ambient sensor is playing a much bigger role in calculating the overheating curves. So Jodu wanted to know if he was able to decrease the recovery times in the camera, as well as using a fan to increase the recording times by pointing a fan at that ambient temperature sensor area. And it worked. It worked tremendously. And here are his findings. So in 4K HQ, after overheating the camera and 20 minutes of recovery time, the first firmware only got him 5 extra minutes of recording. So after it overheated, you let it sit for 20 minutes, he was only able to get 5 minutes of actual recording time, which is terrible. But now in firmware 1.1, after 20 minutes, he was able to get 22 minutes and 6 seconds of actual recording time. So a nice big boost in recovery time added. He then goes on to state that he got full recovery in 30 minutes. So then he did some tests to see if he can extend his recording time with a fan pointed at the port side of the camera, a small little 6-inch fan. In his first test, 4K HQ, 30 frames per second, all eye. Remember, this is internal, so the cards are in a slot and the battery's in there. He was able to get 90 minutes of recording. So after it hit that 30-minute limit, he had to go and immediately record again. And he got up to 90 minutes of recording with the fan pointed at the camera with no overheating warnings. So it's possible that it could indefinitely record 4K HQ internal. And then he did another test with 8K at 30 frames per second, all eye, cards in the slot, batteries in there, small 6-inch fan pointed at the port side of the camera. And this is also indoors, so we'll get to that in a second, but this is indoors, but he got the same thing. He did up to 90 minutes of recording with no overheat warning whatsoever. 90 minutes of 8K, 30 frames per second, all eye, with just a small fan pointed at that side of the camera. And no overheat warning. Again, it could be a possible indefinite recording. Huge news for anyone that wants to shoot in 8K. Now, unfortunately, he did do this test outside. He took the camera outside in direct sunlight with the fan pointed at the port side of the camera. Unfortunately, the camera overheated in 13 minutes. It seems that, direct sunlight on a hot day, it's just kind of cooking everything inside. Not the best case scenario, but it does give great confidence to anyone that's shooting long form recordings in internal temperatures where you can control the environment. You can get some really good times out of this camera. So this firmware alone, while it's not perfect, and I'll talk about some of the things I want to see changed in a little bit, but this firmware alone is a huge upgrade. It allows the camera to take into account the temperature much more so than previously, which allows us to get a much better recording time as well as a shorter recovery time, as long as we can kind of control the temperature and the situation of the camera. Before, nothing that I did was able to cool the camera down or reduce that recovery timer, and that was the most frustrating thing about it. That's where all these theories started to pop up. Oh, it's just Canon limiting the camera. And I just want to state on the record, I was always under the impression that temperatures and time played a factor into the overheating curves of this camera. Just something to say. Nonetheless, this also gives much more credence to that tilt-a fan that we saw when this camera was first released. When you look at the date the firmware was created or released, it was back in July. So it's possible that Tilta had the information about this new firmware and the information about the ambient temperature sensor, and that's where they were claiming these like massive recovery times and these massive temperature draws. It's just giving us more data to believe that these claims are going to be correct. Not only that, if you don't trust Jodu Media, we also have Camera Lab's Gordon Lang with his data point. He left a comment on a previous video stating he was doing external tests with an Atomos Ninja 5 4K HQ 24 frames per second. He had no cards in the R5 but was using the standard battery pack, and he had the Ninja on AC power, and he was able to record a single 2.5 hour ProRes light clip before the battery on the R5 died. He then rigged up a small 4-inch PC fan and pointed it at the rear of the camera and was able to record 3 consecutive 30-minute clips of 4K HQ 24 frames per second before the camera battery died. And there was no overheating in sight, which is excellent news. And I also want to state, and again, thanks to Gordon for all this information, but Canon has also stated that they will be releasing a 1080p 120 frames per second option as well as a C-Log 3 option for these cameras. This camera is just really becoming a great asset to have, and I think once all of like the controversy is kind of blown over, and once Canon has got more data points from the community and they start to really rein in all of this firmware, I think we're going to see a lot of people purchasing into the R5 for a long time, much like we did see with the old 5D2s and 5D3s. In my opinion, I think the recovery time still needs to be worked on. I think if you're able to get the full recovery back in around 5 minutes, then I would consider this a true sort of like professional camera without the use of an external recorder. I know that might be a pipe dream, but anything more than 5 minutes, in my opinion, actual downtime, because remember, you have to turn the camera off to get any sort of recovery. Anything more than 5 minutes, it's kind of, you're still looking for other options, right? You're still looking for that perfect camera. But if they were able to bring that down to around 5 minutes to get full recovery, and you can just go right back to it, you can get another 30 minutes going, I think I think this camera will be really hard to beat. It'll be damn near perfect. So long story short, this firmware is absolutely recommended. I recommend everyone go install this firmware immediately, especially if you're using this camera externally, because you're going to get a huge buff to the screen on time, which is great news. Also, of course, you're going to want this firmware if you're doing any sort of 4K 120 work. Again, thanks to Gordon Lang, we can see that 4K 120 short bursts of it, which is normally how you're shooting 4K 120. It's going to increase that time you're allowed to record in that mode as well. And also, the firmware gives you the ability to get a grip on the overheating and allow you to control the overheating through external temperature solutions like a fan or like some sort of like cooler pack. I'm sure we're going to start to see accessories come out for this camera to kind of actively cool it. And remember, Canon still has like that rumored RF mount fan, which I think will be a game changer for cameras like this. I'm really interested in seeing stuff like that. I wouldn't say Canon's off the hook just yet, but I will say these updates definitely make this camera, which I consider like one of the best cameras that I've owned, just feel that much better. And it's just going to continue to kind of get that. And hopefully one day it is perfect, right? Hopefully one day that firmware can be tuned in, the overheating controls can be tuned in a little bit more, and it can be a perfect camera. All right, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and also subscribe. All these tests take a lot of time, and technically they take a lot of resources. So all I really ask of you is to head over to my Twitter at NoLifeDigital, give me a follow, and subscribe here on this channel. That's all I really want. I appreciate all the support. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments, and I'll try to answer them. And yeah, stay tuned. Got a lot more stuff coming up. Peace.